Hi, my name is Maureen Turnbull-Arbelow, and I'm the founder of Prepare Coaching. I connect people from across the world. I hope to inspire them to learn, to teach, and tell their stories, and cross the many borders that can but do not have to separate us. Have you ever felt embarrassed of your accent? Have people ever laughed at the way you talk? Have you ever felt frustrated that, gosh, you've studied for so many years and worked so hard to speak another language and you still make so many mistakes and you still sound like a foreigner and you still have an accent? Have you ever stopped yourself? Have you ever wanted to do something? Talk with someone, go somewhere, take a trip, or realize a dream, and you stopped yourself. Stopped yourself from talking or traveling because you were embarrassed of the way you might sound or what people might say about the way that you speak, or maybe even about the mistakes that you might make. I can tell you that for so many years, I've been very embarrassed about my accent. Very embarrassed of not being a native, and I don't even know why, to tell you the truth, but I just thought for some reason that I just speak perfectly like a Brazilian to really speak Portuguese, and that if people notice my accent because I open my mouth and I say hello and people ask me where I'm from, and I just get so defensive and I say things like I'm from Porto Alegre or I'm from here, I'm from there, but I'm embarrassed of being from the US. Why is that? It's crazy. There's no reason why I should be embarrassed of my accent. So I'm on this path, in this process, and really doing all I can to not only accept my accent, but to be proud of it. To see my accent as part of me, because when I can not only accept, but be proud of my accent, I can be proud of myself. Because my accent is like my own passport. And all of the stamps on it are just the little parts of my accent that I get from all the places I've lived and traveled, and the people I know, and people who have taught and inspired me. And it tells a story of my life. So to be proud of my accent is to be proud of me, and is to be proud of how far I've come and how much I've learned to be at this place now. And also to just say that I have an accent and to be proud of that, because it's true. And everybody has an accent. I speak 3 languages, English, Portuguese, and Spanish, and I have an accent in each. In my native language, English, that I'm speaking now, I have an accent. And I also make mistakes, and so I don't know why I feel like I can't make mistakes in another language, because I make mistakes in English all the time. I'm always learning in English. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my accent, which tells the story of my life. I always say long story short, but my long stories are always long. So I'll tell you a long story short, a little bit about my accent, and invite you too to tell me and tell us about your accent. What does it say about you? What does it say about your story, your struggles, where you've lived, where you grew up, who you are? How does your accent reflect you? And how can you help me and all of us be proud of our accents? To not be embarrassed, but see it as a stamp of courage. And to say, yeah, I have an accent. And not be defensive or embarrassed, but to be proud. So, yeah, I'm Maureen, and I've spoken Portuguese since 2004. I first learned Portuguese. I decided to come to Brazil in 2004 because in 2005 there was going to be another World Social Forum in Porto Alegre, Brazil. And I really wanted to go, and so I signed myself up for a Portuguese class for Spanish speakers, because when I travel I like to speak a little bit, and I wanted to understand what people were saying in Brazil, and I wanted to be able to talk with people. So I signed up for this class and studied. And then in 2005, I took my first trip to Brazil, and I knew nothing about Brazil, and I barely spoke Portuguese, but off I went, and wow, it really changed my life. And I say that sometimes, and I joke that Brazil changed my life, but it's so true. The World Social Forum and that trip radically changed my life. I was so inspired by the World Social Forum. I also was there, my work was on participatory democracy, and I went there to study the participatory budget process. And I was so inspired, and I was so blessed to meet so many amazing people who brought me inside of the process, and I just fell in love with the participatory budget process, and fell in love with Brazil and Portuguese too. And let me tell you, during that trip, I did not speak very well. Actually, I made so many mistakes. I said so many embarrassing things. I'll tell you later about all of those mistakes that I made. And I didn't speak very well, but what I did was I spoke to so many people, and I came and I experienced, and I learned so much. And I decided in 2006 to return to Brazil, and I also traveled around Latin America studying democracy. And from that trip, I decided, yeah, I'm going to do my dissertation on the participatory budget process. So in 2007, I moved to Porto Alegre. And at the end of 2007, I also married my husband, who's Brazilian and from Porto Alegre. And I lived in Porto Alegre up until a couple months ago. And I learned Portuguese. I studied a lot. And really what I did was every single day speak Portuguese. I was studying the participatory budget process, so I went to meetings almost daily. And I also did oral histories with women who participate in the process. And I also took every opportunity to talk to everybody I could find in Portuguese. So I would talk to the guy at the store and the person at the grocery store, and I would do all these little challenges for myself and say a lot of stupid things and make a lot of mistakes, but I learned a lot. And I always just tried to speak in Portuguese and just tried to speak as much as I could. And I can say now that I speak Portuguese and I speak very well, but I still make mistakes. And like I was saying, people are always telling me all the time how much of an accent I have. And it's hard for me not to be defensive of that, because I always see them as judging me. But really, I do have an accent. And even though I speak Portuguese very well, I still make a lot of mistakes. And when I hear myself, I think, oh, I know that. I know how to conjugate that, or I know that that's masculine or feminine. But when I'm speaking, I still make mistakes, and I think I always will. And nonetheless, I speak Portuguese, and I'm able to live in Brazil, and I've lived in Brazil for so many years, and I have so many amazing people in my life because of that. And I've learned so much about the Brazilian culture and about life, and gosh, I can't tell you how many wonderful people I've met, and how my life is just so different because I speak Portuguese. And I also speak Spanish, and I learned Spanish when I started learning when I was little in junior high, and I took classes in junior high and in high school, and I actually went on a little exchange in high school to Spain, and I really tried to learn Spanish, I think, but it didn't really work very hard, and I didn't really ever learn. I did all these things, but I barely spoke Spanish. Really, my Spanish was not good at all. I knew a lot of vocabulary, but I couldn't conjugate anything, and I really couldn't speak. I was so embarrassed, actually, when I was in Spain that a 3-year-old girl spoke better than me. I can remember that vividly. But nonetheless, when I went to college, I decided I didn't want to finish college without speaking Spanish. So the second to last semester, I decided I'm just going to do it. I'm going to learn Spanish. And so I enrolled in Proyecto Lingüístico, Quetzaltenango, and I studied in Xela, in Guatemala, but also all over Guatemala. And I also did lots of social projects and political projects and traveled for 6 months. But at Proyecto Lingüístico. I studied 5 hours a day for 15 weeks. It was a lot of studying. And I also studied at home when I was done studying. And I lived with a family, so I talked all the time in Spanish. And I also made a real effort. Even the Americans and the amazing Americans I met, and the amazing people from the US that I met, and the amazing people from England that I met, I also always tried to speak with them in Spanish. And any opportunity that I had to speak in Spanish, I did. And by the end of that time, actually for the last month and a half, I went to Mexico, to Chiapas, Mexico, and lived in a Zapatista community. And there nobody spoke English. And I actually ended up speaking Spanish all the time. And I actually even ended up teaching Spanish because the people in the community, most of the children, and also the majority of the women didn't speak Spanish because it's an indigenous community, so they spoke their native language. So I actually taught children how to speak Spanish. So I went from not being able to speak to actually being a teacher. I didn't speak perfectly at all. I made a lot of mistakes, but I spoke very, very well. And then actually when I went back to Denver and I graduated, I taught for a year in a bilingual school, and I taught in English and in Spanish. And when I went to the university for my master's and PhD, I also taught in Spanish. And I talked to so many people throughout that whole time, and traveled and was able to meet so many amazing people and learn so much because of the fact that I spoke Spanish. Of course, I spoke a particular Spanish, and very far from a perfect Spanish, but I spoke Spanish. And I had this crazy, amazing experience actually last month because my teacher, my very favorite teacher, Marlene from Proyecto Lingüístico, came to visit. And she spent a week with us here. And it was amazing to be able to show her around this part of Brazil and just really talk with her because she's just an amazing person. And it was also so humbling because I spent that week feeling so strange and embarrassed and frustrated with myself because I used to speak Spanish. But it's been over 10 years that I've lived in Brazil, and over 10 years that I've barely ever spoken Spanish. And I use that as an excuse, the fact that I live in Brazil and people speak Portuguese here rather than Spanish. But the fact is that I don't use my Spanish. I don't look for opportunities to use my Spanish, so my Spanish is not good. I was speaking with Marlene in Portuñol, and I couldn't believe it, and either could she, that, oh my gosh, my Spanish used to be so good, and I'd worked so hard to learn, and I lost it. I didn't lose it all, but I realize now that I have to relearn my Spanish. And the only way to speak Spanish again is to really incorporate it in my life. Again, because that's the way I learned it the first time. But now I'm trying to make daily efforts to practice Spanish, to speak in Spanish, to think in Spanish, and to speak Spanish again. Right now I'm speaking more Portuñol, but soon I know if I work hard I can speak Spanish again. And well, I also speak English. I was born in Fort Collins, Colorado, and I grew up in Colorado, and I speak with a Colorado accent. We're a little bit country, but for sure we don't pronounce all of our letters. For example, I always say mountain and button, and I don't like to pronounce my T's like most Coloradoans. I also say pop. I don't say soda. Yeah, I'm a Coloradoan, and I have a Colorado accent. I also grew up with my mother and father. My mother is from inner city Chicago, and she's also Jewish, so I grew up hearing a lot of that and also speaking some Yiddish. So that's also a part of my English and kind of a part of my accent. As well as my father grew up in Brooklyn, but was raised in Delaware, so I have a lot of that too. So I grew up in Colorado, but then I moved to California, and I spent 5 years in California. So for sure I took a little bit of that and speak with a little bit of that in my English, and for sure say a lot of things that are from California. And well, yeah, I have an accent in every language that I speak, and I make mistakes in every language that I speak, and I'm learning every day how to speak better. And I'm learning every day about language. I love language, and what's so amazing is that every day we have the opportunity to make mistakes and learn. And And I do that. I make mistakes and learn in all the languages that I speak. And I think that that's amazing. And I really am working to be proud of the way that I speak, to be proud of my accent, and to see it as a stamp of how far I've come, of how much I've learned, how much I've left my culture that I was born into, how I left the United States and learned other languages and have incorporated that into who I am. So yeah, I have an accent, and we all have accents, and it's nothing to be embarrassed about. On the contrary, it's something to be proud of, and it's part of us. And if we can be proud of our accents, we can be proud of ourselves, and we can take chances and cross those borders in different ways, because there's no reason to be embarrassed of who we are. And there's no reason to be embarrassed of the way we speak. We're doing our best and learning every day, and that's all we can do. And I invite you, please, to tell me what you think. What does your accent say about you? Where you've been, what you've learned, what you struggle with, what you hope to learn, and what you hope to achieve. And if you're proud of your accent, or if you feel a little embarrassed, or what you think about your accent, and how you can help me and all of us find more pride in the way that we speak and who we are. And of course, long story long, I'll leave it at that and say thank you so much for spending this time with me, and thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for sharing. And I send you much light and much love and all of the very, very best this universe has to offer.